Welcome to the Numerical Tarot, a new tarot paradigm, an alternative to tradition, an axial system of archetypal crystallography, a trans-culturally anthropomorphized life-biased binary influence calculator, a wisdom system and archetype enhancer with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. In this video we need to return to the idea of a theoretical model of existence and examine other ways of defining its fundamental parameters, so that we can better understand how each number that labels those parameters gets its archetypal character. We need to examine how it functions as a static entity as well as a dynamic event. That's right, as we pass through a static entity, we see how it has a beginning, middle and end. So inasmuch as an event in time also has a beginning, middle and end, we can use the same fundamental parameters to label ideas that progress over time. In a previous video we created a theoretical model of existence with only 2 steps. It birthed a diagram of only 4 circles and a point, which identified a thing, with insides and outsides and a reference frame, which we then labeled with 9 numbers of numerology. We also compared these 4 circles and point to the parts of a planet, and pointed out how various stages of this model represent increasing intensity toward the guts of a core. This suggests an important idea that we see in nature and the universe, that of things coagulating into clumps or things. Like a hurricane on Earth, or a galaxy in space, things clump together. We need to examine this idea further. A good analogy to consider at this point might be that of a bedsheet stretched tight across a mattress, wherein a simple pinch and twist creates wrinkles that draw our focus to a point in the fabric of spacetime. Like a hurricane, the nothingness and the something that the wrinkles point to are made of the same stuff, the only difference being that one is twisted and the other is not, making one a bit more knowable than the other. When twisting lines of force emerge, the intensity of the nothing to something scale intensifies toward the something side and relaxes toward the nothingness side. This creates a condition of coagulation about the defined point, which leads to ideas of insides having a mass of substance with a surface. As coagulation builds a mass, it can also result in a cosmic recoil of content, back into spacetime, i.e. a Big Bang. After that initial encounter of collision and recoil, lines of force can change into an ongoing process of pulsing compression and radiance that continues for the life of any entity. Compression and radiance create the pulsing vibrations of life. When we translate this idea of initial collision and recoil, or ongoing compression and radiance, into opposite numbers on a number line, we use relative distance between opposites to illustrate the relative intensity of converging lines of force upon a center, or midpoint of confluence. The idea of outward radiance is then analogous to those same converging opposites breaking apart, or diverging. Thus our first model, beyond the simple 4 circles and point, involves an elegant simplification of the coagulation process that I call the apart, together model. Interestingly, this model looks similar to a diagram showing how cells in our body divide. In my opinion, a fitting analogy, seeing how this diagram is meant to describe lines of force that create life as we know it. In the apart together model, we see opposites that are completely separate and isolated from each other, leading to opposites that are totally integrated, as well as steps in between. These 4 steps of isolation to integration describe a one-dimensional procession of opposites converging and diverging. In the apart together model, we view the spherical forces of compression and radiance or implosion and explosion as similar in fundamental design, with the only difference between them being the convergence of one versus the divergence of the other. At the 1-9 stage of this model, we see a condition of opposition that is extreme in separation. The numbers 1 and 9 are disparate and isolated by virtue of their extreme endpoint positions along the one-dimensional number line plane, as well as the extremes of point and sphere they represent. Because of this, we come to view these numbers as opposites that are distinctly apart and not communicating, or not transmitting their influence to each other across the separation that divides them. Like wallflowers at a school dance, sitting at opposite ends of the gymnasium. Or Like dance partners standing across from each other, not yet engaged. Maybe like a forward and back in square dancing. At the 2-8 stage we see another pair of opposites which, although still apart, carry an implication of communicative flux within their representative form. Because of this, these opposites are considered to be apart but communicating. I.e., apart, but transmitting their influence across the separation that divides them, in either a convergent or divergent manner, upon the ultimate midpoint of the number line. Like dance partners holding hands with arms extended between them. Maybe like an allemande left, or right, in square dancing. At the 3-7 stage, we see a pair of opposites that seem as apart as the previous two. However, inasmuch as this stage has been identified as the surface of a thing, this 3-7 position represents a kind of skin of connectivity. This is the point at which converging lines of force first begin to touch each other and coagulate into a recognizable form. Therefore, the opposites of 3 and 7 are considered together, but not yet intersecting. Like dancers dancing cheek to cheek, with bodies touching. Maybe a promenade in square dancing. Finally, at the 4-6 stage, we see a pair of opposites that look completely integrated. In the 4 and 6 we see a pair that is not only together and touching, like the 3 and 7, but because they represent the twisted, spiraling mass of the model's core, they are also considered to be intersecting, or overlapping, i.e., exchanging sides or parts of each other. In this way the 4 and 6 represent the condition of marriage and reciprocity that exists between opposites that cross over the midpoint in pursuit of equilibrium. Like dancers in a twirl. Maybe like a do-si-do, or elbow swing, in square dancing. Through this isolation to integration spectrum we see how our model is in fact an isolated entity, apart from all others, and isolated amid the continuum of nothingness from which it came. 1-9. We can also see how our model must relate to other models separate from itself. In other words, models must continually converge and diverge, as cycles continue around them. 2-8. Of course, when finite models converge and connect, we see how the physical contact between them is purely tangential, as surfaces touch surfaces. 3-7. Finally, we observe how models tend to coagulate into larger entities, like families, cities and countries. 4-6. Of course, the larger entities that are formed by coagulation immediately repeat these conditions by virtue of the fact that they remain isolated from other larger entities. 1-9. And must eventually relate to them. 2-8. Connect with them. 3-7. And integrate to form even larger entities. 4-6. As humans, we too are all entities, isolated. 1-9. Relating. 2-8. Touching. 3-7. And integrating. 4-6. Thus we see how, in human terms, each of us can be broken down into constituent parts, while at the same time remaining constituent parts to a larger whole. In this way, we see how genetic integrity remains intact throughout, both literally and with respect to our model's forces. This is the nature of the apart-together model, that of isolation. 1-9. Communication. 2-8. Contact. 3-7. And reciprocity. 4-6. In some ways this model is as simple as the 4 circles and point model, and at the same time the most powerful to build upon. By creating a model that moves from a condition of apart and separate 1-9 to connecting and intersecting 4-6, we incorporate the conditions of coagulation into a one-dimensional numberline form. Now that we understand the objective of describing the nature of a theoretical model of existence consisting of just 4 circles in a point, or 4 spheres in a center, we can move on to observe what each of these simple stages of existence describe. To do this, we will invent other models that have greater levels of complexity to them. But, to the observant reader, that complexity will be seen as completely superficial, and will always be seen as paint poured over an invisible man, who still and forever has only 4 circles and a point to his skeleton. The convergence and divergence of the apart-together model resembled cells dividing. Another analogy we might use to visualize this condition of energy coming together or splitting apart could be a Jacob's ladder of electricity. The idea of intersecting and crossing over to share parts is not as evident in this Jacob's ladder analogy, but the idea of increased or diminished conductivity does come across. As electricity arcs across 2 conductive rails that are bent further and further apart, the separation eventually becomes too much and the arc breaks apart and disappears. In a Jacob's ladder the arc moves up. In the apart-together model this conductivity of consciousness moves both ways, inward and outward. representing to humanity a binary course of manifestation, coagulating inward, and then being expressed outward. And while this idea of electricity arcing or circles converging and diverging might, as predicted, offend those wishing to see evidence of humanity in all designs, this idea of varying distances between pairs is not too far removed from the very human idea of proxemics, invented by anthropologist Edward T. Hall. In the study of proxemics, the idea is to observe how the proximity of people to each other creates acceptable limits of space for different kinds of human interactions. Thus, by comparison, what proxemics calls a public distance is what we typically find between people who are in effect apart and separate. An example might be the relationship between a lecturer and an audience, people at a distance. Or, in the case of tarot, between the hermit and the rest of the world. What proxemics calls a social distance is what we use for casual conversations with friends or impersonal interactions with acquaintances, i.e., when we are separate but together. Moving closer. What proxemics calls the personal distance is when we are together and connecting. An example might be lovers holding hands or people within touching distance and getting personal. Finally, what proxemics calls the intimate distance is where people are found to be connecting and intersecting. An example of this would be people crowded together unintentionally on a bus, or people connecting intentionally for deliberate acts of intimacy and embracing, like the lovers in the Lover's card of tarot, which, if we observe the numbers that have been attached to these stages, puts this act of loving embrace with the numbers 4 and 6, the lovers being a 6 in most decks. Here is the apart together model, unfolded into a number line with anthropomorphized figures. The 2 on either end are apart, not conducting. 1 and 9. The 2 in the middle are together, and intersecting. 4 and 6, with the space between them representing the alternating and co-mingling of a 5. The comparison of the apart together model to the study of proxemics is an example of how a model specifically designed to discuss human attributes can be reduced to an even more basic, fundamental design that transcends all human bias, while still remaining relevant to any human application. In such acts of conversion, the very simple idea of circles, or spheres is easily converted to human bodies to show how the pattern at work is the same throughout. Many more associations like this can be made from such simple, basic, abstract, archetypal concepts of design. If one is keen on alchemistic associations, one could liken the apart-together progression to the idea of spirit entering matter, and the reverse process to spirit being liberated from matter, i.e., alchemistic fusing, together, coagula, and alchemistic stripping away, apart, solve. Alchemy aside though, the fundamental aspects of existence that can be derived from this one simple model are amazing. Can we see the makings of any tarot icons in these notions of isolation? 1-9, communication, 2-8, touching, 3-7, and intersecting, 4-6. I can. To me, the Hermit, as a 9, is an icon of humanity that is clearly tapping into the concept of isolation, 1-9. If the Papess or High Priestess, as a 2, is taken as an icon of inspiration, a Shekinah, she is tapping into the concept of motivation, inspiration in the transmission of electrical impulses that make conductivity happen, 2-8. The connection that most people see in the Empress, as a 3, to that of beauty, and the beauty of nature, and the sensitivity to feel and appreciate these creations, clearly equates with the idea of the surface of a thing being established at the number 3. The idea that lines of force are no longer separate, as in the 1-9 and 2-8, but are now touching also make the idea of sensitivity correlate well with this converging pattern, 3-7. From there, the lovers, as a 6, clearly represent the idea of intersecting and swapping parts of each other, as seen in this model of sides spiraling together. While the Emperor, as a 4, represents the power built up by the mass of coagulation. Lots of people think that an archetype is the anthropomorphized, culturally embellished icon that appears on the tarot card. I don't. To me, the archetypes are these abstract, transcultural patterns. Which is why this study of tarot spends so much time building this theoretical model of existence. No one needs to know any of this to use a tarot deck, just like we don't need to know how a car works in order to drive it. But this study of tarot is not for those who only want to drive. This study of tarot is for those who want to look deeper into things than just the surface imagery of a deck. To look at this model, those adverse to the idea of reductionism might say, so what? How does that totally abstract progression of ideas relate to tarot? It just describes those little circles converging and diverging. It doesn't relate to anything in particular. let alone tarot, to which we might reply by pointing out that, amazingly enough, that lack of association is exactly the point. The apart-together model is a pure and simple diagram of a fundamental act of nature, things converging and diverging. It has no ethnic, cultural, religious or linguistic bias, other than the fact that we are all using English to talk about it. The extremely abstract and conceptual nature of the apart-together model and its separateness from human embellishment is exactly what makes it archetypal. And in being archetypal, many tarot icons can be seen in this one simple diagram, when we cover it with human skin. But why, opponents to reductionism might say, should we care about these abstract associations? What do we gain by theorizing that the hermit is derived from a primordial, archetypal pattern of apart and separate? Answer. We don't really need this knowledge at all to appreciate tarot icons on a human level, or to use them in a reading, if use is our only interest. But, it is being suggested here that through our study of tarot, we can benefit greatly from this kind of knowledge, if we really want to understand the fundamental essence of the archetypal personifications that we see everywhere in the world, across all cultures and ages, whether they be illustrated on little pieces of paper as a tarot deck or not. In the end, it's all a matter of how deep one wants to go in their study of tarot, as different from their use of tarot. This study of tarot and consciousness chose to go way back to what could be perceived as fundamental, elemental, universal, primordial, and most importantly transcultural roots. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Hope it all made sense. Links below for books, decks and merchandise.